In October 1918, an empire that had ruled for over 600 years, that had once stood at the gates of Vienna, that had controlled the holy cities of Islam, that had outlasted the Byzantines, the Mamluks, and a dozen European coalitions built to destroy it, surrendered after fighting a single world war for 4 years. 6 centuries of survival. 4 years of war. Then nothing. Here's the paradox worth sitting with: the Ottomans didn't lose World War I on the battlefield the way you'd expect. They won some of the most lopsided victories of the entire war, Gallipoli, Kut al-Amara, against the 2 most powerful navies and empires on Earth. And yet they still collapsed, faster and more completely than almost any other combatant. So if it wasn't simple military defeat, what actually broke the Ottoman Empire? The answer isn't one crack. It's a structure that was cracking in 5 or 6 places at once, and a war that struck every single one of them at the same time. Historians who've spent careers on this question generally agree on one thing: there was no single cause. It wasn't just bad generals. It wasn't just German meddling. It wasn't just geography. It was a compounding failure, a state that entered total war without the roads, the doctors, or the food reserves to survive it, led by men who kept gambling the entire army on offensives the empire couldn't afford to lose. Every factor made the others worse. That's the story. The root cause isn't a battle. It's a railway map. The Ottoman Empire in 1914 controlled a landmass nearly 5 times the size of France and Germany combined, but it had barely 5,000 kilometers of single-track rail, a fraction of what its rivals had. There was no rail line connecting the eastern and western halves of Anatolia at all. A unit leaving Istanbul for the Caucasus front could spend the better part of 2 months just marching to get there. A staff officer of the period reportedly noted that Ottoman soldiers were exhausted before they ever saw the enemy. Then came the decision that turned this weakness into a catastrophe. In August 1914, War Minister Enver Pasha signed a secret alliance with Germany, and by October he'd committed the empire to war by ordering a surprise naval raid on Russian Black Sea ports. Without full cabinet agreement, without a mobilized economy, and without the infrastructure to fight on the 4 fronts that alliance would open, the empire was now at war with Russia, Britain, and France simultaneously, and its own transport network couldn't move an army fast enough to defend any of them properly. Once the war began, the mistakes piled up. First, Sarikamish, December 1914. Enver personally took command of the Third Army and launched a winter offensive through the Alahukbar Mountains to encircle Russian forces in the Caucasus. Ottoman troops were ordered to leave behind coats and tents to move faster. The Third Army entered the operation with 90,000 to 118,000 men. By mid-January, it was down to roughly 42,000 effectives. Most of the loss wasn't Russian bullets, it was frostbite, exhaustion, and disease in temperatures that fell below -20. Second, using defeat as a pretext for atrocity. Rather than accept that poor planning caused Sarikamish, Ottoman leadership shifted blame onto Armenian communities, accusing them of collaborating with Russia, laying rhetorical groundwork for the deportations and mass killings that followed in 1915. Third, a multi-front war with no reserves. Simultaneously fighting in the Caucasus, Mesopotamia, the Sinai, and eventually Gallipoli meant no theater ever had enough men, guns, or doctors. The empire had barely 2,400 military physicians for the entire war. Fourth, an economy that couldn't feed its own soldiers. Requisitioning grain and animals for the army devastated Anatolian farms already stripped of labor by conscription, setting up famine conditions that would later kill as many civilians as bullets killed soldiers. Fifth, command instability at the top. Enver, Tulat, and Semel, the ruling triumvirate, often ran their own fronts as personal fiefdoms, coordinating poorly with each other and with their German advisors. Sixth, non-Muslim manpower sidelined. Large numbers of Christian and other non-Muslim subjects were pulled from combat roles into labor battalions, which shrank the effective fighting pool right when the empire needed every rifle it could field. And finally, chronic desertion. As losses, disease, and food shortages mounted through 1916 and 1917, desertion rates climbed into the hundreds of thousands, quietly bleeding divisions that looked intact on paper. To be fair, the Allies made plenty of their own mistakes on these same fronts. The Gallipoli landings were planned with maps drawn partly from tourist guidebooks. British intelligence badly underestimated Ottoman fighting ability, assuming that a declining empire meant a declining army. A costly assumption once the campaign began. Logistics for the Mesopotamian campaign were so poor that an entire British Indian garrison, cut off and starving, was forced to surrender at Kut al-Amara in April 1916, one of the worst capitulations in British military history. This wasn't a war of Ottoman incompetence against Allied brilliance, it was a war in which both sides stumbled constantly, but only one side was already this fragile going in and could least afford it. There's also a subtler failure worth naming here: strategic overreach dressed up as pan-Islamic ambition. Enver didn't just want to defend Ottoman territory, he dreamed of using the war to rally Muslim populations across the Russian and British empires, from the Caucasus to Central Asia to India, under Ottoman leadership. Sarikamish wasn't a defensive maneuver. It was the opening move of that dream, and its failure didn't just cost tens of thousands of men. It cost the empire its best chance of shaping events on its own terms for the rest of the war. Every subsequent Ottoman offensive, from the failed attacks on the Suez Canal in 1915 and 1916 to the ill-fated push into the Caucasus again in 1918, carried an echo of that same instinct: gamble the army now, and hope the political payoff arrives before the casualty reports do. Here are the numbers that tell the real story. Over the course of the war, the Ottoman Empire mobilized between 2.85 and 3 million men, starting from a peacetime army of just over 200,000. Official Ottoman figures from 1919 put total military losses at roughly 2.29 million killed, wounded, sick, or missing, more than two-thirds of everyone who ever put on a uniform. And the ratio of how they died is the real tell. One post-war medical study found that disease killed roughly 7 Ottoman soldiers for every one killed by enemy fire. Compare that to Germany or France, where combat was the leading cause of death. The Ottoman Empire wasn't just outfought. In huge measure, it was outsupplied, outdoctored, and outfed. If Sarikamish was the empire's first great unforced error, Gallipoli was its last real triumph, and it's worth slowing down here, because it shows exactly what the Ottoman army could do when geography, not overextension, was on its side. In February 1915, an Allied naval squadron tried to force the Dardanelles Strait by ships alone, hoping to sail straight to Constantinople and bomb the empire out of the war without ever landing a soldier. Ottoman minefields and shore batteries wrecked that plan in a single afternoon, sinking or crippling several battleships. So in April, the Allies came back with troops instead. British, French, Australian, New Zealand, and Indian forces scrambling ashore onto beaches overlooked by cliffs the defenders had spent weeks fortifying. What followed was 8 months of some of the ugliest trench fighting of the entire war, compressed onto a strip of land barely wider than a city block in places. Ottoman defenders, organized under the German commander Otto Liman von Sanders, with a young divisional commander, Mustafa Kemal, playing a decisive role, held the high ground at Chunuk Bair and the ridgelines above Anzac Cove through assault after assault. In the August offensive alone, thousands of men died fighting over hillsides that changed hands in a single morning and were abandoned again by nightfall. Flies, dysentery, and thirst killed almost as efficiently as rifle fire on both sides of the line. By the time the last Allied troops slipped away in the dark in January 1916, in a withdrawal so well executed that Ottoman defenders barely noticed it was happening, Allied forces had suffered on the order of 250,000 casualties, and Ottoman defenders a similarly staggering toll, with some estimates running past 300,000 and roughly 87,000 Ottoman dead. It was, on paper, a decisive Ottoman victory. It saved Constantinople. It made Mustafa Kemal a national hero years before he would found the Turkish Republic on the ashes of the empire he was currently defending. And yet it changed nothing about the deeper arithmetic of the war. because while Gallipoli was being won, the same railway problem, the same disease rates, and the same overstretched fronts were still quietly grinding down every other Ottoman army from Baghdad to Jerusalem. A single successful defense, however heroic, couldn't fix a transport network or feed a starving province. Gallipoli bought the empire prestige. It didn't buy it time. Picture a young conscript from an Anatolian village, marching for 6 weeks just to reach the Caucasus front before Sarikamish. His boots are cardboard thin by the second week. At night the cold is so total that men who fall asleep sitting up simply don't wake. He watches friends lose fingers to frostbite before they've fired a single shot. Later, on a hospital train rattling back toward Istanbul, he lies pressed against men burning with typhus, and he understands, with the plain clarity that only exhaustion brings, that the empire's real enemy was never only the Russian across the valley, it was the cold, the hunger, and the doctor who never came. Multiply that one soldier by nearly 3 million conscripts, and you start to feel the actual shape of the collapse, not a single dramatic defeat, but millions of small, grinding losses that never made it into a headline. None of this stayed confined to the battlefield. As grain requisitions stripped Anatolian villages bare and the rail system funneled what little food remained toward the army rather than the cities, famine spread through the eastern provinces. Bread lines in Istanbul grew longer through 1917 and 1918 even as the government controlled the flow of information about frontline defeats. Civilian death tolls from disease, starvation, and the forced deportations of the war years are estimated in the millions, a demographic wound so deep that Anatolia's population and its social fabric were permanently altered, with entire communities displaced or destroyed in the eastern provinces. That civilian catastrophe wasn't separate from the military story, it was downstream of the exact same failures. The roads too poor to move troops quickly were the same roads too poor to move grain. The bureaucracy too thin to track military losses accurately was the same bureaucracy that couldn't organize famine relief. A government that could no longer feed its own people, or convincingly explain a string of costly winter offensives, was a government losing its claim to legitimacy long before any army reached its capital. Desertion swelled not just because soldiers feared death in battle, but because men increasingly worried more about their starving families back home than about the war itself, and slipped away to try to provide for them directly. By 1918, war weariness wasn't a mood. It was a structural fact of Ottoman society, visible in empty granaries, in emptied-out villages, and in an army whose paper strength no longer matched the men actually standing in its ranks. So when the Ottoman Empire finally sued for an armistice at Mudros in October 1918, it wasn't the result of a single lost battle or a single bad general. It was the sum of a railway network that couldn't move an army, a leadership clique that gambled entire armies on offensives the empire couldn't afford, a medical system too thin to keep soldiers alive, an economy too fragile to feed both the front and the home front, and years of accumulated desertion and disease that hollowed the army out from the inside. Military defeat, economic collapse, and political fracture didn't happen in sequence. They happened together, each one making the others worse, until there was no single thread left to pull that could have held the empire together. There's a popular myth that the Ottoman Empire was simply the sick man of Europe, destined to fall apart no matter what, a relic too backward to survive the modern age. The record doesn't really support that. This was an army that modernized quickly, fought Germany's ally, Britain, to a bloody standstill at Gallipoli, and held multiple fronts against 3 empires simultaneously for 4 straight years. What broke it wasn't backwardness. It was the impossible math of fighting a fully industrialized war with a pre-industrial supply chain. That same math, logistics as destiny, would go on to decide plenty of 20th century wars long after the last Ottoman soldier laid down his rifle. If the idea of an empire gambling everything on a single winter offensive and losing almost everything sounds familiar, it should. It's a close kin to the story we told in our video on the Battle of Stalingrad, where another army bled itself white trying to hold ground it never should have advanced into. If you haven't seen that one yet, it's a natural follow-up to this. And if you want more deep dive breakdowns like this one, no myths, just the sources and the numbers. The best way to support that is by subscribing. If you'd like to help fund the research behind these videos directly, our Patreon link is in the description below. Thanks for watching.